Okay, so I'm basically sitting down to write this right after finishing Bloodborne, but wow, I'm sad I didn't get to play this for my first video, which I guess this is the follow up to now. Bloodborne was incredibly fun, and honestly, it would have been my favorite out of all the Souls games that I talked about. Has it dethroned my favorites? Well, like that other video, I'll talk about that at the end, but for now, I just really want to talk about the game. The best thing for me that Bloodborne introduces, and I'm sure this is not an uncommon opinion, is trick weapons. I love them so much, and it's truly a shame that they really haven't been revisited ever. It's honestly kind of an interesting highlight for me because I made a point in the other video about the Souls games that weapon and build diversity and build variety is kind of really what I loved about Elden Ring. But I feel like this game like objectively lacks that. Especially for someone who really focused on Dex because I really wanted to use the Blades of Mercy and Rakuyo. There are like maybe two other good weapons, including the starter weapon, a Threaded Cane for Dex build. This probably isn't the case for the other builds though, but I still really don't regret it because I had a ton of fun even just using that handful of weapons. If I had just had to use the Threaded Cane for the whole game, I really wouldn't have complained. And it's because each weapon having the two stances and a pretty varied moveset even within and among the weapons kits, there's just so much to do with all the weapons. That might not be the case for every weapon I've tried though. For example, the weapons that like became guns or bows, or even like Ludwig's Holy Blade, I didn't really fall that much in love with. But all the weapons that I ended up using, like those I listed, really kept me interested the whole way through. The ring and talisman equivalents, being the runes and the blood gems, were not really super unique though, and also weren't very build defining either. If anything, those were kind of the most forgettable gameplay elements. It's definitely not a game that can be played over and over again for multiple New Game Plus cycles like Elden Ring or Armored Core, just by the merits of its weapon builds. I do want to play it again with a more strength-focused build, because I want to use like the Moonlight Greatsword and like the wheels, but like that's about it, right? But to be clear, I actually don't think that's really a mark against the game. It doesn't need to be super replayable to be an incredible experience, even the first few times through. And honestly, being developed between like Dark Souls 2 and 3, I don't think it's that surprising that there aren't like a million different build paths, when that wasn't even really the case with the Souls trilogy. Speaking of that, though, it does have a little bit of the early Souls control stank, mainly jump being tied to run and dodge, which just got me hit way more times than I'd like to admit, as well as just kind of a weird, clunky, fast travel system. But all that said, it does very noticeably, both graphically and control wise, feel better than Dark Souls 2 at least. I just wanted to mention this to talk about those because I never really quite got used to accidentally inputting jump even by the end of the game. But the thing I do kind of stand by is the blood vial system. Well, like mostly. I know this is a thing that people complain about, especially early game, but I just never really found myself without a place to easily get a bunch of them from enemy drops, and honestly, I only very occasionally ran out, only after ramming my head into a boss way more times than I really should have. I do really get complaining about it for those situations though, and for many people, a lot of those bosses will be those ones they get stuck at, and thus they'll get frustrated when they have to farm a bunch of blood vials. It could definitely be improved for sure, but for the vast majority of the gameplay, it was kind of a side thought, like a small resource management game, kind of like the life gems. Do I want to use the vial here, or can I greed it a little, you know? I think it helped me to just not compare it to flasks, because there's a lot about this game that makes that comparison pretty hard to make. Enemies have like generally higher lethality, the hunter's just a fair bit squishier, and there's not like super tanky armor you can equip to compensate for that. And plus there's the rally system, which is another mechanic that I think a lot of people like, but honestly I don't know if it adds quite as much as people give it credit for. It does encourage aggression for sure, but for some bosses and enemies that kind of just adds up to mashing R1 frantically during the recovery window, and I don't know how interesting that really is. But at the same time, it definitely enables the more frantic lethality I mentioned earlier, and I don't really think like the system's bad or anything, I just don't think it takes away or adds as much as people think it does. What does really do that for me, though, is the firearm parry and the visceral attacks, which is kind of weird coming from me, given I don't parry really at all in the Souls games, but I think the higher pace and greater reward for the parries really encouraged me to get up in their face and know all the timings for all the attacks. I think it's this, in addition to the higher pace and the higher damage, that really makes Bloodborne's identity, and as a result, the bosses that really push you to engage with all those felt amazing. I know in traditional Souls games, bosses that can be repeatedly parried are seen in like a negative light, but I think the pace and speed of attacks does a lot of work to making it feel fun. So that means, of course, my absolute favorite bosses are those high-paced Hunter v Hunter matches, like Gascoigne, of course, is the very first one. He's pretty much the welcome to Bloodborne boss. Gearman is also a great way to close out the game, assuming you aren't fighting Moon Presence, which I did, I guess. But honestly, the absolute peak is Lady Maria. I honestly may as well just be making this video entirely to gush about Maria because holy shit, I loved that fight. And honestly, I just love everything about it and her. She's like honestly my favorite boss now and probably the whole non-Sekiro Fromsoft catalog. And honestly, she's up there with the likes of like Owl and Sword Saint Ishin. She's like that good. Honestly, her being so good really made me sad that Frida from Dark Souls 3 had that like ugly duo phase 2 that I really didn't like because she would have been really sick if she just had like those kind of phases like Maria did. Maria's whole fight feels like just an elaborate Bloodborne dance starting from the very first phase. But then when she gets her like Bloodblade in second phase and then like the Fire Trail like Gale in the third phase, which are both just so visually and mechanically fun to dodge, she definitely gave me some trouble, but I had so much fun the entire time. She's one of those like rare gems of a bosses that when I beat her, I felt both super elated, but also pretty sad because I can't fight her again until a new game. Don't get me wrong, like Gascoigne and Gearman definitely delivered as well, and honestly even like Orphan of Cause right after was really good. But man, after Maria, I was just chasing that peak the whole time. As a result, the like beastly Eldritch bosses were a little disappointing in comparison, though honestly it's mostly just that a lot of them are Souls bosses and they don't have that same like Bloodborne-iness. And obviously I don't mean like aesthetically, they're obviously from Bloodborne and they're very visually distinct from like Souls bosses. I just mean like mechanically they don't give me that same rush as the human characters did. But they're not even like bad bosses, right? Like I think the boss quality is actually really insanely high, but they just weren't like super Bloodborne-y. Which makes a lot of the last few bosses kind of feel flat compared to Maria. But honestly, like in a vacuum, I think they were really good overall. My favorite ones of those were probably like Amelia and Ligarius, who I think are probably pretty popular too from what I can tell. Something else that really blew me out of the water, and I think is honestly some of the best in all the Souls games, was the map design. Because the whole map is all consisting of that beautiful labyrinthine design, with all those really convenient shortcuts looping back to the same like one or two lamps. I honestly always felt lost, but I also was always making good progress and ended up back at a shortcut. It was kind of interesting. And this obviously isn't to mention the beautiful Victorian aesthetics of everything, like it looks so good. Like outside the chalices, I genuinely don't think there were any misses whatsoever in any of the dungeons. I don't think they peaked nearly as high as the DS2 DLC, which I still think is some of my favorites, but just like the bosses, the overall quality and the lack of issues I have with them probably make this some of my favorites as well. But mentioning the chalices, those are, to put it lightly, interesting, I guess. I think it's definitely cool to see how much of these are pretty much just the origin of the catacomb dungeons from Elden Ring, but they did also feel distinctly a little more primitive. Maybe those like other two chalices that weren't the first one are more interesting, but I just didn't really care that much to grind them out. Honestly, they're really great for if you just want to play that much more Bloodborne combat, especially with the randomly generated dungeons, but for me, I just didn't really find myself wanting to go back all that much. They're also good farming locations from what I understand for gear and gems, but I just really didn't find that super necessary given what I was already given. This might be my bias, but it definitely felt like a mechanic that was more at home in an open world game like Elden Ring than as like a distinct side thing you could maybe do in a linear game. The world and the world building was also really interesting, but I'm going to be honest and say that it still didn't catch my attention quite as much as like Elden Ring. I think this era and style of world building from these Souls games has never really rubbed me the right way. I feel like this style of world building in the Souls games really fits the open world very well, where you can actually see landmarks and NPCs to give you a lot of visual and textual information about the world. I feel like in these games where you definitely have to find specific items and specific NPCs, and maybe some of them are even a little hard to find and conditional, it's really kind of hard to connect the dots all the times, figure out what the world is trying to tell you. But from what I could pick up from the Bloodborne lore, especially from the DLC, which is more compact and thus a little easier to actually pick up the things they're putting down, I think the themes of trying to find a cure, even if flawed, as well as the overdependence of blood and the realization of what the side effects are, in addition to like all these factions working against each other for the cure, definitely were very interesting. And then of course you have like the weird, creepy Eldritch stuff, which is definitely very weird and creepy, and I think that's probably by design. I think all of these are well executed. I just wish that it was easier to piece together and kind of easier to essentially tell what the moral of the story, quote unquote, is. Not to say it's not present, of course, you can definitely tell where a lot of the morals are coming in, but it's never quite as clear as the story of the Dark Souls trilogy with the first flame and the linking of the flame and all of that. But otherwise, mechanically, I feel like for everything altogether, this just really feels like what I was looking for out of the Dark Souls trilogy when I started those. Is this my new favorite overall? Well, I guess you can make a case for that, but I do still think Sekiro improved on it and has it beat on making that satisfying dance-like combat. And of course, Elden Ring just has an aesthetic and mythos that I really specifically fixate on. But the world, the gameplay, and the lore of Bloodborne definitely has a similar draw. It's definitely a bit of a toss-up to be sure, but I'm happy to just say all three of these are my favorites, like, collectively. If they were to make a Bloodborne 2 with like a vast arsenal of trick weapons and the improved quality of life, role building, and build diversity from like Elden Ring, as well as a more focused boss design, I think that would easily be the best game bar none, not just from Fromsoft but of all time for me. But given that they don't even seem to be really willing to make a 60 FPS remaster, I'm not keeping my hopes up. But I certainly can dream. Thanks for watching.